Good evening. Yesterday, the ANC's National Executive Committee published its statement to drive forward the economy. One of the issues it discusses is what are called network industries. These are industries that have an impact on the economy as a whole. This focus is also found in the proposals put forward by the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni. One of the key network industries involves cell phones and cell phone data. In other words, these documents are saying they're working towards reducing the price that you pay for cell phone data and the price you pay simply to access information. The idea, of course, is that helps the economy. But there are many reasons as to why our data prices are high. Those reasons are important in working out how we can bring prices down. To discuss this tonight, if you like the nuts and bolts, the zeros and ones of internet data, Anton Kotz is an expert on these issues at the consultancy Ellipsis. Anton, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Good evening, Bruce.
Okay, so it sounds like a simple proposition to reduce cell phone data. There are lots of reasons. We'll go to the market reasons in a moment and competition, and you can say what you like about the cell phone companies then. But let's look at the technical reasons first. There are issues around spectrum. So start me at the beginning and use small words. What's spectrum?
Okay, Bruce. Sorry, Bruce. Stephen. Spectrum is essentially radio waves. Now, radio waves permeate our lives. We find it everywhere, from cooking our food in the microwave to operating the remote for your car or your television. When it comes to telecommunications, spectrum is those radio waves in a band that are used to construct networks, telecommunications networks.
So in other words, if I'm using my cell phone to phone Tsepiso, I'm using a particular radio wave band to do that.
Correct, yes.
And that means someone else can't use that band at the same time, otherwise I'll be talking to someone else.
Well, in the same area of same
Yes.
base station, yes.
Okay, so then does that mean that certain parts of the spectrum are more useful for certain things than for others? In other words, not everything is useful for, say, broadcasting FM radio. Not everything is useful, in this case, for broadcasting the signals that cell phones use to get to data networks.
So absolutely. So spectrum is divided into bands, and each band has a specific application. You could have, for example, aeronautical use, maritime use, telecommunications, and even then it's broken down into, for example, Wi-Fi, terrestrial wireless, mobile services like 4G or LTE.
Okay, this is finite, right? I mean, it's not infinite.
Yes.
You can only use certain patches of it for certain things.
Well, for the specific application, it's a finite resource.
Okay. How difficult is it to manage? I mean, governments around the world need to manage this quite carefully, I imagine.
So it's a tricky thing to manage, but let's just take a step back. There's what I call macro management, which would be sort of at a global level. The International Telecommunications Union have agreed with countries who's broken up in regions as to what specific frequencies we'll use, and with a few variances, the regions are sort of similar. So that's the macro management. Then when we come to each country, within those bands that have been agreed at the ITU, ICASA, our regulator, have to now issue spectrum to players who would like to use it for a specific application. So if it's two-way radios, then there might be players in that market, or it's military use or police use. In the mobile networks market, there's obviously a few players in our market that would be interested in using that spectrum for their networks. And that's where it becomes a bit tricky.
Okay, so you have overlapping uses for spectrum. So you could use a certain parts of spectrum for one thing or another thing, and those, I suppose, come down to economic choices.
Exactly, yes.
As I understand it, there's a relationship between all of this, the spectrum that cell phones use to access data and terrestrial television. So we've got 4 terrestrial television channels on the VHF, the very high frequency and the ultra high frequency, the UHF bands. I mean, in the old days, you used to have to sit and tune your TV with a little manual tuner, and that's what you were actually doing. Yeah. Now, just explain the link between what those TVs are doing, those channels, and data and internet data.
So those frequencies can be used by the data companies, but currently it's being used by the broadcasters. The commitment from South Africa was for the broadcasters to have shed that spectrum by 2016, but 2016 has come and gone and it's still not done, and it looks currently like it won't be done until mid-2021.
Okay, So if we switch off, so if we move to digital terrestrial television, which, as you say, has been a long time coming,
Yes.
I think we're possibly the last country actually in Africa to go there. There have been various complicated political reasons involved in that too. Once that happens then, does that free up a lot of spectrum for cell phone data, for 4G internet?
It will free up spectrum, and it should go to be allocated to players who can actually make use of that and serve the demand for it.
How much spectrum does it free up? I mean, are we going to see a big change?
Yeah, I'm not too sure on that currently.
It depends basically on what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, so once we have that spectrum right, that means that we have more space to do what we want to do in terms of increasing internet data. Does that mean that it's also cheaper necessarily or not necessarily?
Well, it should be cheaper. Whether it will be cheaper is a different question. So the Competition Commission published their sort of provisional findings in April this year. They did an inquiry into the cost of communication, the cost of data. And they found that it won't necessarily be sufficient for spectrum to be released to reduce the cost. There has to be other factors to drive as well, like service-based competition, price-based competition. So it's the Competition Commission at least is doubtful that spectrum alone will be the panacea to reducing the cost of data.
Okay, so if I'm MTN or Vodacom or Cell C or Telkom Internet or whatever it is that I am, Telkom Mobile, excuse me, and I want to get my hands on this spectrum, is it for free, gratis and for nothing, or do I have to pay for it?
No. The last aborted auction attempt in 2016, the reserve price per lot, and there's a few lots for different applications.
So
like
different parts of spectrum?
Correct, yes, or different bands. The reserve price per lot was 2 billion rand. So spectrum is at least a high demand spectrum that will be used by mobile network operators in their networks is very valuable and comes at a price.
So you'd get that set of spectrum for the country for 2 billion rand?
Correct, yes.
What is the difference?
Well, that's the reserve price. So that would be the minimum price.
Okay. There's also, of course, I mean, certain waves, certain parts of the spectrum move in different ways in terms of distance. So would you want to use a different band for, say, Sandton or Bishop's Court or, Clifton Beach, where I'm sure everyone has a 4G smartphone? Or would you want to use a different area for, a different kind of band, for example, in a more rural area?
Sure. So in your bands, the lower the frequency range, the further the signal will travel without having to have a repeater. And obviously the shorter the signal range, the more dense population it can serve. But you're 100% correct. The different attributes of the different frequencies will determine its best use and application in a specific scenario. I think the problem that the mobile companies have right now is that they don't have enough of a particular type. And so they would have to compensate by, for example, putting more equipment and more base stations in their networks, which comes at a higher capital cost.
Okay, so if you're in a rural area, you're just never going to get the same data? It's unlikely.
Well, I can't speak for the mobile's investment strategies.
Okay, good answer. All right, so that's the technical side. Let's sort of change gear slightly and look at the competition, so the market aspects of this. We have, I think in most people, if you go through a Sunday newspaper, you'll see adverts for 4 big cell phone networks, right?
Yes.
MTN, Vodacom, Cell C and Telkom Mobile. Is competition working in our market?
I don't think so. I think we still have too much of a concentrated market. And, ICASA and the Competition Commission has made similar findings. ICASA, in their priority market studies, found that the market for wholesale mobile data should be the first priority that would need to look at pro-competitive interventions. And then the Competition Commission also found in their data, cost of data inquiry that they released their provisional report in April this year, that there's huge scope for improvement in price competition in the mobile data environment.
Other countries have 4 networks. Why are our 4 not competing against each other properly?
In other countries, the third and the fourth operator generally also battle to collectively between them get 10 to 15% market share. It's a common phenomenon that late entrants into this market do battle.
Okay, so in a way, it requires some kind of intervention to improve the situation, and by that we mean market intervention.
Yes, I think it does.
I imagine there'll be all sorts of opposition to that from the companies.
And we've already seen recommendations in the provisional report by the Competition Commission in terms of interventions, and they've made recommendations that could have immediate impact, and they've made recommendations that could have a longer term impact.
It seems, and I mean I stress this, it seems as someone who's not educated in all of this, that the two big cell phone companies went through a period of making quite big profits. Now look, they were first, and that basically meant that they had the market to themselves, a sort of duopoly in some ways. Has that situation really changed, or they're still making a big profit?
Well, I must be honest, I don't follow their financials that closely, but I think Vodacom's making more profits than MTN, yes, if I listen to the news headlines. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough environment. South Africa has become a saturated market since a few years ago, and so they're competing amongst each other for the same market share, really. But still, MTN and Vodacom, between the two of them, are dominant and probably too concentrated in my view.
Okay, so then how do...
Sorry, you could see that with Cell C, especially when Eleanor Craig went and joined Cell C, there was a bit of a price war, but it stopped because at some point MTN and Vodacom just stopped matching Cell C's specials, and same happened when Telkom entered the market. They were very aggressive with their pricing, and MTN and Vodacom simply just refused to match them, and we didn't see them losing massive market share. Conversely, we also didn't see Cell C gained a few points on market share, but not really anything significant.
And Cell C, of course, has big financial problems at the moment, from what I understand.
I understand so too.
Okay, so what then needs to happen to make competition work? You talk about the interventions that are planned.
Yes.
I mean, years and years ago, as an example, in the States in the 1980s, actually broke up a big national telephone company, I think it was Bell, simply because it was too big. I mean, I can just imagine the lawyers rubbing their hands with glee if someone tried to do that with Vodacom or MTN.
So I think before we go there, we need political will. You opened this discussion with yesterday's statement, but we've had much of the same since 2010. In 2005, for example, in the State of the Nation address, then President Zuma promised a newer, bigger, cheaper telecommunications infrastructure through interventions that would come, and from a regulatory and policy perspective, we are today exactly where we were in 2015, and nothing has happened. So we've got many puzzles, many pieces to the puzzle that needs to come together to reduce the cost of data. A lot of that needs to come from an enabling environment which needs to be put in place by regulators and our government, and it's just not happening. So that's where the first point we need is political will to start making things happen.
Is ICASA missing in action here, the communications regulator?
I think they definitely are. It's interesting. In 2010, ICASA intervened in the cost of making telephone calls through regulating the interconnect rate and implementing a glide path, which has had a massive impact on the cost of making calls. And it's a great case study for a well-executed intervention and the positive impact that can have. I just don't know why they don't follow their own case study in intervening in the cost of mobile data. There's been reports, and there's been talks, and there's been press releases, and there's been presentations in Parliament, but nothing happens. I think ICASA is definitely missing in action here.
It is true that cell phone data in South Africa has started to come down. The price per gigabyte and megabyte has started to come down quite dramatically. And I mean, part of this possibly is because there's so many more Wi-Fi places. You can go to any burger bar in Joburg or Cape Town, you get free Wi-Fi. There's also, of course, fibre, which means that many houses have fast internet, which they didn't have before. What's your prediction then for mobile data prices? Are you expecting the prices to continue to keep coming down, or do you think it's going to take some time?
I think it will continue to come down, and I think it will continue to come down especially more so if the interventions from the Competition Commission is implemented and starts gaining traction. And those would be, first of all, issuing spectrum. But secondly, looking closer at electronic communications facilities and the accessibility of those. So things like cost-based roaming agreements, access to masts and towers. And then also, more intervention on price-based competition. Then we will definitely see costs coming down. What I think will have much more of an impact, and something that we've been lobbying for a while now, is for the networks to separate their networks from the services they run across those networks, so that you can start building an open access network environment. And that's exactly what government saw, and that's why they were punting the wholesale open access network, which comes with its own political sort of hot potato elements to it. But we see this working extremely well in the fiber market, where the majority of fiber networks currently being deployed are open access networks with service providers competing on the same networks with each other. And what we've seen there is not only prices come down, but also innovation going up and service levels going up, because you have to differentiate. At some point, the price gets to rock bottom, and then you have to start differentiating somewhere else. And we've seen this happening in the fiber industry. And I think it's a great case study with some, obviously it's not exactly the same technology, but it can be a great case study for mobile networks, and then we'll definitely see a lot more benefit.
Good to see some optimism that cell phone data prices will come down. Anton Kotz, I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. Anton Kotz is from the consultancy Ellipsis.